Well, good morning and welcome. I am Beth Doores, and my colleague, Dr. Aeryel Williams, and I are looking forward to have a conversation on how to create a more equitable co-curricular community. First, we wanted to see who is in the room. So if you wanted to go ahead and put in the chat either your name or your institution, and perhaps one thing that you want to get out of the conversation today. I think we have some quiet folks in the room, but that is okay. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, great. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Elizabeth. Wonderful. Hello. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces here. As we just learned here just a bit ago, technology can either be really great or sometimes challenging and problematic, and we just roll with what we have at that time. So I'm going to also go ahead and put in this chat the slide deck to our conversation. So if you get disconnected or we get disconnected, you at least have the resources available, and it does have our contact information as well. During the conversation, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat feature, and either Dr. Aeryel Williams or myself will be able to answer those questions in real time. So Dr. Aeryel Williams will interrupt me and vice versa. If able to get to your questions, certainly we can follow up at a later time. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk a little bit about our background and how we show up into the conversation as our institution is answering and wrestling with this question. There are certain skills that we felt like were really favorable in terms of our background, and also just a little bit more about the background of Washington University. We're not going to necessarily go into detail about the data points. That is certainly in the appendix of the slide deck that we've shared with you, but we're going to talk about the climate because that does play a factor into the conversation. And then we're going to talk about that process. How do we get to the point we are today? And how did we create a curriculum to be able to start to answer and wrestle with the question of creating a more equitable community? And then certainly as curriculums change and evolve, we have this idea in our mind that it's all going to work, but pivots do happen. And so Dr. Williams is going to talk about what those pivots were and some of the impact that we were able to see. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and share some resources with you that hopefully will help you, your staff, community members be able to engage in dialogue and thought into the conversation. Ultimately, we hope that there's a couple of things that you get out of this conversation. In my 15 years working in higher ed, I enjoy to see something so I can react to it, whether I agree to it, not, want to pull information. So hopefully you're going to have a framework to approach the work at your own perspective, respective institutions. Additionally, we're going to have those resources, whether they're videos, articles, or books, as well as an overview of our curriculum so you can take that with you at your prospective institutions. And then certainly there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. So we're going to give you some great feedback moving forward. And I think the biggest thing here is a community to dialogue and process. The work in diversity, equity, and inclusion is a lot. And sometimes when you are shifting such a change in your prospective institution, there's a lot of voices, and our students really embrace voices through online platforms. And so certainly having a thick skin in this conversation is important, as if you see some of the newspapers at Washington University of our student life, you see polarizing thoughts and conversations and brand questions of the folks in here. So a community is always welcomed, and certainly you have that going into the conversations within your background. So let's talk about who we are and our institution. As I mentioned before, I have been in this field for the last 15 years. I use she, her pronouns, and most of my time has actually been in small private institutions, which ultimately means that resources and being crafty and creative and serving as a generalist is something that I'm very familiar with. I also come from mid-sized public institutions in my background, receiving my undergraduate at Western Illinois University and my graduate degree at Illinois State University. And where I want to draw your attention to is my experience and work within experiential learning. I think in student affairs, we do a lot of experiential learning, which is great. I also had the opportunity who work in the academic side and working with course credited program that works with our undergraduate and graduate students in consulting nationally and locally with nonprofits, for-profits, and startups. So certainly that did help in terms of constructing the information. My current job is I work with our governing body, which I'll talk about in a little bit, our student group, and we use campus labs. We call that WUGO, or Washington University Group Organizer. I also work with our student group conduct, and a couple months ago absorbed our sorority and fraternity life community, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then we have a immersive program, a 3-day immersive program with first-year students to connect them to St. Louis community, as well as the WASHU community that I also work with. Now, Dr. Aeryel Williams is going to introduce herself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As Beth mentioned, I am Dr. Aeryel Williams. I have a very broad professional background, having worked at many institutional types. I have also self-published a book. The most recent edition is entitled Always Traveling, and I am a proud member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, and it's still our centennial. I did just recently complete my doctoral work at Louisiana State University, receiving a PhD in higher education administration. And some of my professional experience over the last 10 years has been within academic advising, diversity and inclusion work, residence life, student involvement, and student leadership development. Thank you. And so that has been really useful in working with these students and through this virtual platform. And I'm actually in Los Angeles, so shout out to everyone I saw that was at UC Riverside and Dominguez Hills. I'm actually in California, and so trying to build rapport with the students has been has been challenged, but great too, because the students have been very committed. So I'm really happy to have been brought onto this project.
So let's dive into some conversations. Just for context, Washington University in St. Louis has about 7,000 students here, undergraduate students specifically. And so our students have the opportunity to engage with around 400 student groups with 14 different categories. And so I want to draw your attention to the most popular groups that we have in terms of number of groups or organizations are in the academic side and in diversity and inclusion. And something else I wanted to note as we're talking about our affiliation is our sorority and fraternity life community. We have 4 different umbrella council chapters represented of the 25 chapters we have here on campus. In addition to, we have a citywide approach with some of our NPHC chapters here, which offers a unique perspective and dynamic as we're going to be talking about our conversation later on today. And so 2 years ago when I came in here, one of the conversations that we had was how do we collect the data? And are we having processes of being exclusive in our membership practices as it relates to orientation? And so my colleague, Peggy Hermes, and I looked at our student group management registration process and started to add in data to ask that question. And some of these things are what we were able to find. And so when we think about the new member experience, we're thinking about a moment in time that a person has to take in order to come into that organization. So about 14% of our community has that. What we found to be interesting is that we do have a pretty exclusive process in our membership because we have a selection process for 37% of our community, which means an audition, a tryout, some type of initiation. And so this was something that was brought to our attention, and we started to see and think about what does that mean for our community. And then 2 years ago, our institution did not have, before 2018, we did not have a requirement to have an advisor. And then 2 years ago, we introduced the model of having an advisor and really assessing our student groups and determining whom would be required and not to be required to have it. And of that 73%, 42% of our advisors are required because of their job duties to do that. And Dr. Aeryel Williams is going to talk a little bit more about our advising model, but I do see our percentages of number of advisors to our student groups increasing over the next year or so. So let's talk about that climate and that climate that we all may be feeling. So you might see some information on the screen that you're like, yep, I'm feeling that too. So our students are very academically driven. They come from the top 10% of our high schools. And they're also activists here. This is the most activating student population I've had the pleasure to work with. So it is not unusual for our community to do 2 to 3 protests in a given month and take action in ways to mobilize voice and change. We also have a very privileged background. And when I think about privilege, I think of a couple of things. One, only 13% of our students are Pell eligible, and about 10% of our students are first generation students. And so access to information, access to our community and understanding college, our students are very comfortable with that information and come from a home that has privilege. We also, in tandem with who our student population is, there's a lot of action that has been happening over just the last year. And one is our student union. And so just to give you some context about our governing body, we have 16 different entities, around 250 members, and a budget of $3.9 million, which is a large amount of money. And just to give you some additional information, those funds are allocated towards salaries, some of our salary items, department-driven programs that are geared towards students, along with our student groups. So it's a very robust amount of money, and it's allocated in a variety of different ways. And I say that because last year's President Tyron Trong was really looking at our systems of financially providing to our groups and our programs and services and saying, how are we being equitable with the funding that we have? In addition, he started to question the process and the system that our governing body was in, and some of the systematic oppression that was happening as related to race. And our new president, President Raymond Miao, was able to take that effort and continue it with some of the action items about equity and really looking and diving into it from a local to a national level. In tandem with that, with St. Louis and the unrest that has been happening, there's been a lot of questions about our university police. We have a sworn in police department here. And so questions of whether or not that was relevant or not has been happening. And then finally, as we are looking at our community, in July, there was a racist comment that was made on an anonymous social media site that really triggered our conversation about an abolish movement, which resulted in about 55% deactivation of our community, and mostly within our women's sorority. And so that these were tipping points. The tipping point was really this July timeframe of action. But as you can see, there's a long history of systems of oppression that has been happening before any of us came into these roles, but also we start to see that action take place. And then we add on some really great, interesting time as we have a new chancellor and a new provost. And then in light of the pandemic that was happening, we also had hiring freezes that were happening and furloughs within our staff, which really created this transitional time for those that were here and those that were on furlough. And then finally, we had our sorting fraternity life community. We have 3 full-time employees that all transitioned early on in the abolish movement conversation. And that is how we welcomed our sorting fraternity life community into my area, as I was governing or advising our governing body, who is really activating this space as well, which offered an interesting perspective that Aeryel is going to talk about a little bit later. And then let's throw in some things that we all are feeling, from this nationwide protest to the pandemic to an election year. This slide is very organized, but I will tell you that it was a very interesting and perplexed time. It was not as organized as it is on here. So we were wrestling with that. And so now Aeryel is going to talk a little bit more about some of the areas of harm we started to see and how we were able to get that information.
Thank you, Beth. And so when I was brought into the role, one of my assignments was to start reviewing the Instagram handles that popped up this summer. So speaking to that social and student activism, as well as that unrest that the students were seeing, they created these Instagram handles that spoke to and exposed some of the harm that they had experienced. So specifically, the Black at WASHU page, the AGL WASHU page was focuses on abolishing Greek life for the IFC and WPA chapters, and then the #MeToo_WASHU page, which really highlighted a lot of the harm around sexual harassment and assault. And I would just encourage you, if your students have created any pages similar to these, to really deep dive and review what they have shared anonymously, and try to create this more equitable co-curricular experience for students, as well as just a safer place for our students. And so this was definitely a very revealing part of the project, and I'm still learning from some of the experience that the students have shared, but these pages were very tough to read, but definitely educational. And so from those pieces, we were able to differentiate which pieces of oppression were affecting the students most. And so a lot of the cases focused on racism. And as Beth mentioned, the racist comment that occurred in July. And so just to give you all a little bit of context, the first post on the Black at WASHU page happened June 14th. Then the AGL WASHU page popped up on July 2nd. And then the Me Too page, their first post was on June 16th. So this was all happening at the same time for students and helping them to expose the harm. And so that also included the classism, hazing, homophobia, and transphobia, interpersonal violence, which speaks to mental, verbal, and physical abuse for the students, and then sexual harassment and assault.
And so as we started to look at some of the spaces, we started to define that there was a lot of conversations around these 4 areas. Our spaces, as Aeryel will talk a little bit more, is very inequitable as it relates to our student groups. And so there was pause to have conversations about what do we do with that. And as I talked about earlier, this exclusionary practices of a new member experience started to come in, and the cost associated with our experiences started to take shape into the conversation. And then the overall experience, we started to see that there was a lot of normalized hazing that was happening, whether that was in our academic areas, whether it was in other parts of those categories we mentioned before. We certainly started to see this rise of what does that experience look like and what is the harm that we are needing to address. And so how do we do this? It's ever evolving, right? You go into this conversation and you do work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and there's so many different pockets. Systematic oppression is there's a root, and then there's branches that interconnect. And so, one of the things that we did is we really needed to think about that process. And how do we think about that process? It's about what guides the work that we do. And so there's a couple of different models that we utilized to help us create the curriculum. And one was our social change model that was created in the early 90s at a research institute in UCLA, that really focuses on individual values, how they come into our group values, how do they come into our society to create that change. And it is a model that we use a lot within campus life. It's our guiding model. In addition, as I mentioned before, experiential learning, I love it. I think it's a really great concept. David Kolb, experiential learning, really helped us think about how do we take the action and continuously think through an equitable co-curricular community. It's always changing, always evolving. And so this model really did help us and create that. And then there's a nonprofit here in town called Forward Through Ferguson, who developed a model called a Path to Racial Equity, which is designed to help individuals and organizations see the path toward racial equity and distinguish between its different phases, as well as locate themselves on the project along with it. And so our Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who focuses on education and work around faculty and staff, adapted that into this culture of change so that we were able to use this in a way to address where we are at and what type of experiences we're having, whether it's from a culture, institution, or an individual, but how are we creating that sustainable experience? And it does take time in these 3 different areas to be able to do. And so on page 40 of the link that I provided you has more explanation around the culture of change and how we utilize it here at WashU. And we also thought about the framework, right? We are always informed by our stakeholders, and there's those primary stakeholders that are our groups, it's the institution, but we also have our secondary framework, which is about our city, St. Louis, that plays into a factor, and our national organization, which plays into a factor. And so they inform the work that we do, but we're always influenced by our values, how we show up as individuals to our groups, similar to that social change model. That's how we're influenced. But we also have to think about how we think of our operations. So how do we interpret all of these different pieces? And so that's where we started to develop this framework, as you can see, where we were able to lift it from a website called Nonprofit Quarterly. It's a community engagement governance. It's a practice to create a framework, and we love that. And so as you can see, in order to think through how do we create a more equitable community, we have to think about it from a training, and how is the university training folks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how are our groups addressing that question. And when we think about things like membership practices or advisors, we're thinking about how does our national show up into that conversation? Or when we think about space, we're thinking about St. Louis and what is St. Louis doing around this work to create a more equitable community. And so in order to be able to answer that question, we have to think about all of these different operational functions. And we also have to know and acknowledge that there's a lot of influence around the work that we do. And that led us into understanding that we wanted to have an advisory board, and it's called the Co-Curricular Advisory Board, or CAB, as we like to call it, to focus on a student-driven, led, action-based approach. As you recall, our students are activists. We want to get engaged. They're academically driven. So curriculum and research and diving into understanding is very much a value at our community. And so that's where we were able to create that process. There is tension between the university and our students at this point, as we talked about before. And so we knew we needed to have an independent consultant come in to be able to address the concerns and harm so that there was no confusion around biases or information. And the university is one of those stakeholders, right? So we need to show up in the conversation too. And so we were able to create it in a way that was able to do that and also have some work associated with that. And we divided our student part to the conversation, and Dr. Williams will talk about her part. There's some additional asks that we had of her into 5 different areas so we could process it. We could define where we were, baseline our students and our experience, and then transition into exploring, mobilizing, and then creating that action in which our students were able to present some really great findings here last week. And so all of that being said, we also had some responsibilities that Dr. Aeryel Williams is now going to talk about, in addition to leading our co-curricular advisory board, diving in deeper to the question at hand.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. And so being brought on as an external consultant, I was given an outline of what the expectation was. And a lot of that included what's listed on this slide here. So that was facilitating weekly meetings with the board. We conducted focus groups, which I created from scratch with the questions and organizing who was going to work with who. Benchmarking other colleges and universities around these harms and how they were addressing the issues for their students, developing and implementing a survey to assess student groups and chapters and their needs, and then additionally pulling together findings and research and recommendations with a timeline for the registered student organizations and chapters. And then there's also a separate report for sorority and fraternity life. And then we also created a formal presentation, and I'll speak more to that shortly. So thinking about hiring a consultant, maybe that's not in your budget, but I'm going to give you the pros and the cons about this opportunity. This actually was a great opportunity for me professionally, and thank you to Beth for bringing me on. I actually had pursued a full-time position with WASHU earlier this year, but because of those hiring freezes that she mentioned, I was unable to finish that process. And so because of my interviewing process, she was able to call on me later. And so this was a really great way for me to still get connected with the students on this campus. The pros to my outside perspective is I have additional experiences that I could bring into this space. I have a fresh look at what's going on, and I have a non-biased approach to the situations that the students are addressing. The cons that I experienced was just coming on later in the semester after a lot of the students have already engaged in conversations around the harm and the abolishment movement. And then also just building a rapport with the students in this virtual space. I know that they did have some on-campus experiences and I was not able to participate in that. There was a development of a curriculum that Beth was able to share with me. And from that pre-developed curriculum, I was able to have autonomy in adding where I saw fit and pivoting pieces that I really needed to make sure that the students focused on. Additionally, there's a timeline that we were trying to follow, as Beth just spoke about. And I really do think that this could be a semester-long commitment. I did come on board in October, and my commitment ends in January, but this could be a semester-long or even a year-long process. The report submission and just making sure that we're getting the information from the students and then my pieces all tied together by the date that they would like to have it completed, and then communicating with the students and being a part of that recruitment process. One of the challenges that I did see was that for the students that are typically marginalized and underrepresented or underserved, I reached out to them personally after this process had begun, and they were a little bit reluctant to participate. And so trying to make sure that they're engaged in the process and speaking for their own needs and what they are looking for as far as change is concerned, I would have liked to have been able to be more successful in that area. But as far as additional opportunities, I think that this position doesn't necessarily have to be a consultant. You could work with a current employee to add this into their, what's that favorite phrase that we have at the end of our job descriptions, duties as assigned. It could be one of those pieces, or you could also create a NASPA or NACA internship, a practicum or graduate assistantship for any of your master's students. If your institution does not have a higher ed program, this could also be good with anyone in the nonprofit sector or social work, things of that nature. And then also being an independent study. This would be a really great opportunity for a student to really focus on this work and partner with your office. And now we'll go into the impact. So let's talk about the process and some of the student experience. There was an opening meeting on October 2nd, and speaking to that recruitment piece, it was open it was an invite that was sent out to the student body at large, and we had 30 students participate in that call. From that call, we were able to retain 10 students who were fully committed to this process. And there was actually, which was very interesting, there was a Student Life news article that went out and basically said that students left because the project was not aligned with the abolishment movement, because the students were very focused on having Greek life removed from the institution. But that wasn't really the case. The majority of the students were not able to participate because of the time commitment. They didn't know that it was going to be ongoing meetings, and that we were going to really deep dive into some of these topics. And then just making sure that there is diversity and representation. I just want to highlight that piece one more time. So again, we had weekly meetings as a board. And so we found the time that worked best for the students. There were campus partner conversations that took place. And so working with Residence Life, Student Conduct, the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, et cetera. We also organized focus groups, as I mentioned previously. And so that was an opportunity to mobilize the students on the board, as well as Campus Life staff and our other campus partners. And so we met with student groups, leaders from student groups, as well as chapter advisors, and asked them some really tough questions about the harm that they might have seen personally or as a witness to, and how they would really want to see the change on the campus take place, and even asking them, like, timeline wise, when are you looking to see this change? And so that helped us to develop buy-in and engage campus wide. One of the pieces that I added along the way was to assign the students to watch Grand Army on Netflix. And I'm not sure if anyone has an opportunity to watch that yet, but it's a really fantastic short series that basically exposes and creates kind of a visual aid to a lot of the topics that the students were talking about as it relates to harm. And then seeing students younger than them, because it was in a high school experience or high school context, having an opportunity to address these issues as student activists, what the consequences are, what the process is, what it looks like, and how they can show up for their peers. And so it was a great piece to add in. And then also doing the social media assessment. And actually the students were assigned to review the pages as well, to get more insight, and not just focusing on the AGL page, but the Black at WASHU and the Me Too page. Moving from there, we were able to achieve a lot of incomes, and I've summarized it to this piece, but this has been a really great process, moving the students through the social change model and the curriculum. The students were very engaged with that. I even had one student who expressed that while it was, technically more work for them, it was an opportunity for them to get some leadership development as a part of being committed to this board. And I really love that perspective, because this is an opportunity that's unique, and a lot of students will not be able to engage in this way in their typical collegiate experience. They also had an opportunity to work on identity development and goal setting. During our first meeting and throughout, I asked them what was their goal and their vision for being a member of this board, and what they wanted to see happen on their campus. And so they were able to create they actually gave me over 30 ideas of what that vision might look like, and I summarized it into four overall points. But it was really awesome to hear that these students were very forward thinking and committed. They also developed student recommendations, in which we created a 12-page document so far with just their recommendations. And then we had 3 presentations last week, which included an opportunity for one student to speak to the campus life staff. 2 students were able to speak before the board of trustees, and then the entire board was able to do a presentation for some key stakeholders that will be helping to mobilize their ideas. And then I will be providing a full report and an executive summary for the campus life staff. And then in February, they will have a university response that will start to engage the issues that have happened, and then explaining what changes will take place and along what timeline. So going back to those operational areas that Beth mentioned earlier, there were 4. And now, as you can see, this slide is very full, and we were able to identify a lot of areas that the students needed to focus on in order to create that change and a more equitable space for their peers, which includes diversity and inclusion, space equity, sorority and fraternity life, the membership experience. And that's not just for sorority and fraternity life. I have come to find out that a lot of their organizations have a membership experience of some kind, training and education pieces, policy and procedure, as well as systems and operations. So here are a few examples of the student recommendations. One of the most poignant pieces is they want to dehouse fraternities, and then also repurpose the sorority suite. So there are these spaces that have been on the campus for a long time, but they are really geared towards the IFC and WPA organizations. And so their idea is to create more living learning communities within the houses, and then give these sorority suites to affinity groups so that they can have a space to meet and host events. In addition to that, they would like to have a mandatory executive board position related to diversity and inclusion, and that student leader would have an opportunity to engage in additional training to be able to handle those instances as they occur. They also want to increase the training and education for current members and new members, and they want to ensure that that will be ongoing. And so they want to create a policy where if you do not participate, or a certain number of your members do not participate, you will not be an active chapter or organization. So they're really thinking about some bold ideas here. In addition to that, they would like to create a more organized landing page that helps to connect the students to all the resources on the campus. One of their ideas also includes hosting a town hall meeting with the campus life staff to be able to maintain conversations and input from the student body. And another piece of this is creating transparency with the sorority and fraternity life process, so they can know what the demographics are of the students who are interested in the organizations, who is actually accepted into the organizations, and then creating feedback pieces around that, so that we're able to track more closely what the students are going through as they join these organizations. And so from there, my recommendations as a consultant, I definitely think that they need to work on increasing the campus life staff, which they're currently in the process of doing. But since they did lose 3 staff members who were focused on sorority fraternity life, and a lot of the issues were found within sorority and fraternity life, definitely having a support for those groups there. And then also they're in the process of creating a more unified Greek council to support the organizations that are historically Black or Latinx. And so making sure that they're supported as well. And then creating relationships that are authentic and genuine for the students, because they recognize the turnover, and they recognize that some of their complaints or concerns have left with the person who left the institution. And so just being able to make sure that those are sustained. I definitely think it's important to increase sexual health and education and awareness at the institution. After reading the Me Too page, there's a lot there to unpack. And I just think as students are coming into their collegiate experiences, they're being exposed to a lot more, but they're also coming in with a lack of education. So I think this is by far one of the most important recommendations that I'll be giving. And then in addition to that, mental health resources and making sure that therapy and counseling is available to the students. I definitely think, as Beth mentioned earlier, they've just created this advisor requirement for the organizations, but maybe re-looking at what that relationship is for the students, because as they said to me, they don't want someone who's just a signature. They definitely are looking for someone who is committed and engaged with their organization. And then sustaining the cap beyond this commitment that we have right now. So we're actually in the final processes of wrapping everything up. And so having a way to check back in, keep the engagement and follow through is really important for the students. And they definitely feel that beyond their commitment. And even when they graduate, they want to make sure that the changes are taking place.
And I would also add in to the conversation too, that there's a couple of things in real time that is happening. So as you're addressing your co-curricular community and systematic oppression, that doesn't mean that you have to wait for whatever that process to conclude to make the change. And so our community really addressed that, especially our sorority and fraternity life community, and some of the things that we needed to change. And so that's where we lifted in a accreditation program. And a sorority and fraternity life accreditation program has probably been around for the last at least 25 years or so, in evaluating and taking note. Our sorority and fraternity life community, what I was able to glean from the couple of months that I've been engaging with them is that our operational tools on the back end really were set in that 90s kind of time frame and not really elevated in a way to support that progressive mindset that our students have. And so, the accreditation program seemed to fit really well with us versus a scorecard that some institutions have in order to align our values to the responsibilities. So if we say self-governance, this is how we're holding ourselves accountable. I envision that accreditation program is going to be all of our different categories. Those 14 categories will have some type of an accreditation program moving forward out of this process, as that seems like a favorable communication and track. And in addition to that, because it was so deep rooted into the harm within sorority fraternity life, we've been doing a really great work in terms of talking about each particular chapter to their national, and nationals coming involved with the space of the DEI work, or diversity, equity, inclusion, that we need to address not only as a chapter, but then as a community. So there's been several conversations about that and several recommendations in moving forward. And so this is where we're going to take the time to talk about some of the resources we encourage you to take. Part of the work we have to do is also as professionals. And sometimes we forget that we need to be a part of that solution or take time to be able to do that research ourselves. And what I am a big advocate on when we are working with DEI work, we need to look at it from the position description that we write for a graduate student, whether it's a student worker, whether it's a professional staff member, and absorb that into the construct of the position. When we do hiring practices, that should be the forefront of our conversation. And then we should be able to implement, as we have a Generation Z, the complexity, the nuances are at the forefront of our population we are serving. That equally means that we need to make sure that our diversity, equity, and inclusion shows up. There's a lot of conversations about our Gen Z and really having a trauma-informed approach to the way that we counsel. And so certainly we need to think through the celebration of the uniqueness of our Gen Z students. So that is something that I would encourage you to think about as you're adapting practices, and some of the resources is how do you pull that into the community. As student affairs professionals, most of our degrees may have a slant in that counseling, right? So we might be counseling our students, have some type of variances with that, but we also have our counseling services at our prospective institution that can dive deeper into that. The same should be in the same respect of the diversity and equity and inclusion. Some of us have specific offices that do really great work in specialized area of focus. We also need to show up just like that counselor voice that we have as professionals engaging with students, and then troubleshooting our students into the support from a counseling. We need to be able to do that with our DEI work. And so those are some of the encouragement and recommendations we would have for you. Listed here are a couple of different books. Highly, highly, highly recommend One is the social change for a better world. That's our social change model. And later on in the curriculum, we do have a link available for the facilitator's guide that I was able to find online. So you can have that for free. There's a couple of folks or a couple of conversations on you as an individual leading versus the number 4 contested issues in troubled times, student affairs, dialogues, and equity, civility, and safety. That is a great way to network with your team, book club, or a common reading effort from student affairs. I would encourage you to take that to be able to process and absorb the information. As you heard before, there's been a lot of conversations, and our institution really has a lot of conversations around race. So you can see some of the articles we utilized in the processing and construct relate to race. One of the pieces I would encourage you to focus on is the number 1, the characteristics of a white supremacy culture. We often forget or not realize some of the systems and how they have evolved into it. And I think as higher education, we have a lot of work to do to evolve and really evaluate systematic oppression. And so these are articles that align with thinking through the work and how we can process. And of course, we have some TED Talks that we would encourage you to take over and review. Finally, we have some great information here, not only the facilitator guide, but we did create the curriculum overview that you can utilize and process. We would recommend that you are able to get your city, so for us, St. Louis partners, departments involved into the buy-in approach. As our community engages, our students engage in our faculty and our staff in different departments. So you really should be working and engaging with a variety of different areas just to make sure that you have thought through it, because it is a large campus-wide initiative. We also included something called the Jamboard. Highly recommend in this virtual setting. This is a great way to use Post-it notes and be able to engage and share a model, and it's free. So we would encourage you to do that. Certainly our tipping point came in a pandemic space where virtual was needed to be able to do that. You know, in an ideal world, we would love to create that human connection, so vital to the work that we are doing. But as Dr. Aeryel mentioned, we are progressing and continuing to keep an advisory board and continuing to do the work post this virtual time frame, so that there's longevity, because change takes time. Mobilizing efforts takes time. And so this is part of that time that you are able to devote and talk with us a little bit more about our process and how we're engaging in real time. Dr. Aeryel Williams and I are very excited to continue our journey together as we move forward to see the outcome of our work that we are doing. So certainly we have provided us our contact information, so you can email us according to the needs of your institution. We're also happy to take questions. So we tried to hurry up in some of these parts just so we would allow some time for you to answer or ask questions that you may have around some of the topics we discussed. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, at least so that our viewers online can process. And again, thank you so much for those that were online watching this on YouTube. But for those that are here currently, what questions can we answer for you?